Tonight, I want to be absolutely clear with you from the very first second. What happened this week was not a surprise, it was not an accident, and it was not betrayal. It was the predictable outcome of a system pushed past its breaking point. For months, quietly, methodically, American industrial policy has been replacing certainty with chaos. Tariffs announced, paused, threatened, reshaped, signals sent, then withdrawn. And while politicians argued about loyalty, capital did what capital always does. It measured risk, it measured time, it measured stability, and then it moved. General Motors did not abandon the United States. The United States abandoned predictability. That distinction matters more than any press release or angry statement issued after the fact. Because once uncertainty becomes structural, history stops being an anchor. It becomes dead weight. If you drive a car, if you work for a living, if you believe manufacturing still matters, this story is about you. Not ideology, not personalities, structure. Stay with me. To understand why this decision happened, we need to look beneath the announcement and examine the system that made it inevitable. To understand this moment, we need to strip away the headlines and focus on the real question underneath them. This is not about Canada versus the United States. It is not even about tariffs in isolation. It is about whether modern industrial economies can still offer something corporations require above all else, a stable operating environment. Manufacturing is not speculative capital. It cannot pivot overnight. It requires decade-long commitments, fixed assets, trained labor, and predictable rules. When those rules change erratically, investment does not slow down. It reroutes. That is exactly what we are witnessing here. The GM announcement was not a rejection of America. It was a rejection of volatility as a governing principle. For years, U.S. policymakers assumed that market size alone would guarantee investment. That assumption is now failing. What this episode exposes is a deeper vulnerability. When policy becomes performative rather than structural, firms stop listening to rhetoric and start redesigning geography. And this is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Because once capital discovers an alternative system that offers clarity and continuity, reversing that flow becomes extraordinarily difficult. To see why this pressure has been building for so long, we have to step back and look at how American industrial policy arrived at this point in the first place. To see how we arrived here, we need to understand the historical bargain that once made American manufacturing dominant. For decades after World War II, the United States offered something few others could: scale, infrastructure, skilled labor, and most importantly, policy continuity. Companies could plan 10, 20, even 30 years ahead because the rules of the game were stable even when politics changed. That bargain began to erode long before this administration. Globalization stretched supply chains across continents. Financialization rewarded short-term returns over long-term capacity. Governments slowly stopped thinking in systems and started governing in cycles. But the foundation held because predictability remained intact. What changed in recent years was not the existence of tariffs, but their behavior. They stopped being tools and became signals, announced abruptly, revised publicly, threatened repeatedly. In that environment, risk became unquantifiable. And when risk cannot be priced, capital does not negotiate, it exits. This is the deeper mechanism at work. Not ideology, not nationalism, a breakdown in time horizons. Once that happens, every major industrial player begins asking the same question: where can we still plan the future without guessing tomorrow's rules? That question set the stage for the first rupture. The first real rupture did not come with a speech or a tariff announcement. It came with silence. And in industrial systems, silence is never neutral. For nearly a year and a half, analysts noticed something unsettling. No new major U.S. facility announcements. No long-term expansion timelines. No confident capital signals. Behind closed doors, planning models were being rewritten again and again, each time accounting for a different trade scenario, a different tariff regime, a different political mood. That kind of planning does not produce factories. It produces paralysis. Then the filings appeared, quietly, unusually. Canadian regulatory disclosures that General Motors had not touched in over a decade. These are not routine documents, they are signals. Signals that a company is preparing to move at scale, with speed, and without asking permission. When the announcement finally came, it landed like a controlled detonation. $25 billion, Ontario. Batteries, assembly, research, jobs, not incremental, not symbolic. Decisive, and notably, irreversible. If you are still thinking this was a negotiating tactic, pause here. Corporations do not spend $25 billion to make a point. They spend it to change reality. What followed next revealed why this moment matters far beyond one investment. At the center of this decision sits a mechanism most political debates never address directly. Certainty is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. And when governments fail to provide it, markets build their own alternatives. From GM's perspective, the problem was no longer tariffs themselves, it was the inability to model them. When policy becomes reactive, when rules are announced before they are designed, firms lose the ability to commit capital with confidence. A factory cannot be paused and restarted like a press conference. Once steel is poured and supply chains are locked, reversals are expensive, sometimes fatal. Canada understood this vulnerability precisely. They did not simply match subsidies. They offered a time horizon, a decade-long framework, clear trade terms, regulatory continuity, workforce pipelines. In other words, they replaced uncertainty with structure. This is the hidden asymmetry in modern industrial competition. Money matters, yes. But predictability matters more. When one country offers incentives without guarantees, and another offers guarantees with incentives, capital chooses the latter every time. This is why Washington's response missed the point. Accusations cannot compete with architecture. And once architecture is in place, the next shock becomes inevitable. The second escalation arrived not with the investment itself, but with the timing. That detail matters more than most people realize. General Motors announced its Canadian move exactly 72 hours before the next round of proposed auto tariffs. That was not coincidence. That was anticipation. This was the moment Washington lost leverage. GM did not wait to be cornered. They moved first. By locking in Canadian incentives and regulatory guarantees before new trade measures could land, they removed uncertainty from one side of the equation entirely. What remained was a U.S. policy environment defined by threats without commitments. Inside the administration, the reaction was immediate and urgent. Emergency meetings, angry statements, reviews of contracts, public denunciations, but none of it addressed the core problem. None of it restored predictability, and none of it could reverse a decision that had already been operationalized. This is the danger of governing through pressure rather than planning. Pressure works only if the other side cannot move. GM proved that assumption wrong. And once that proof exists, it does not stay isolated. Because now, every other automaker is watching. Now I want you to step out of the boardroom and into real life. Because this is where the abstraction collapses into consequence. If you were promised a job in Ohio, in Michigan, in Tennessee, those promises are now suspended in uncertainty. Not because you failed, not because demand vanished, but because policy made long-term commitments impossible. For generations, manufacturing offered something rare: dignity anchored in stability. You worked, you planned, you raised a family. That social contract depended on one assumption that the system would not change its rules overnight. When that assumption breaks, workers pay the price first. This is why the emotional response in Washington feels hollow. Patriotism does not pay mortgages. Anger does not retrain workers. And blame does not reopen factories. What you are seeing is not corporate cruelty. It is systemic neglect revealed too late. If you are watching this and feeling uneasy, you should. Because this is not just about GM. It is about whether governments still understand their responsibility to create conditions where people can plan their lives. Remember this moment. And if you want accountability, demand structure, not slogans. What happens next moves beyond borders. Once capital begins to move, it does not stop at national borders. It reshapes the global map. What happened this week sent a signal far beyond Detroit or Ontario. It told governments, investors, and corporations exactly where stability now resides and where it does not. Canada did not just win a factory, it won credibility. In a world where supply chains are being rebuilt and energy transitions demand massive upfront investment, countries are being judged on their ability to reduce risk, not amplify it. And this judgment is happening quietly, relentlessly, inside boardrooms around the world. You can already see the ripple effects. Other automakers reassessing timelines. Other governments refining incentive packages. Other workers wondering which side of the border their future will be built on. This is how industrial power shifts, not with dramatic collapse, but with incremental redirection. The United States once shaped these flows. Now it is reacting to them. And reaction is always weaker than design. When leadership abdicates planning, markets fill the vacuum with their own logic. To understand where this path leads, we have to confront the future directly and accept that multiple outcomes are now possible. From this point forward, there are only 3 plausible paths, and none of them are abstract. They are already forming. The first path is correction. Washington recognizes that unpredictability is a cost, not a weapon. Trade policy is stabilized. Incentives are paired with guarantees. Capital is given a reason to return. In this scenario, GM's move is remembered as a shock that forced reform, a painful but constructive reset. The second path is stagnation. Rhetoric softens, but structure does not change. Threats are replaced with vague promises. Investment hesitates. Capital slows, waiting for clarity that never fully arrives. Manufacturing does not collapse, but it no longer leads. This is how great systems fade quietly. The third path is escalation. Pressure replaces policy entirely. Tariffs multiply. Retaliation follows. Corporations adapt by leaving. In this future, GM is not the exception, it is the precedent. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Systems do not choose among these paths emotionally. They choose them mechanically, based on incentives, based on time horizons, based on whether governments understand that credibility, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The final outcome will depend on one thing: whether policymakers are willing to govern reality rather than perform defiance. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. What we are watching now is not a trade dispute. It is a test of competence, a test of whether modern governments still understand the basic contract between policy and prosperity. Because capital is not ideological. It does not care about slogans, speeches, or blame. It cares about rules that last longer than a news cycle. General Motors did not make a statement. They made a move. And moves matter more than words. $25 billion did not cross a border because of disloyalty. It crossed because certainty was available on one side and absent on the other. That is the lesson policymakers refuse to confront. If Washington responds with reform, this moment becomes a warning that worked. If it responds with escalation, this moment becomes the beginning of an industrial exodus that will be studied for decades. The window for correction is short. Capital does not wait. If you care about jobs, about manufacturing, about whether the middle class has a future, do not get distracted by outrage. Demand structure, demand predictability, demand policy that understands how systems actually function, because the countries that win the future are not the loudest. They are the most prepared. And history is unforgiving to those who confuse pressure with power. This story is not over. It is only entering its next phase. And we will be watching it closely because what comes next will define far more than the auto industry.